Today I'll be talking about scalable drug discovery with Apache Beam and how we at Schrodinger have been using Apache Beam. We've been using it for the past 2 years to build our scientific workflows, and we're very excited to talk about it today. I think our use case is a little bit different than some of the other use cases here. So a quick intro for myself. I'm a staff engineer at Schrodinger. I've been working there for 8 years. And I started off working on some of these larger scale scientific workflows for our group enumeration, which I'll talk about later. And that eventually led me to work on kind of general distributed computing infrastructure at Schrodinger. And that's what my team does today. So here's this. OK, so the agenda for today, we'll go over 4 sections. We'll talk about Schrodinger and talk about what we do. We'll focus on the drug discovery platform, and we'll talk a little bit about workflow engines at Schrodinger. From there, we'll motivate how Schrodinger started using Beam. We call our integration Seam. And we'll talk about a new runner that we've written called the Seam runner. And then we'll eventually lead to applications and what we sell to customers and what runs on Beam for us. And then if we have time, we'll talk about future direction as well. So at Schrodinger, we write software to make discovering new novel molecules easy. Our platform supports 2 major areas of molecular discovery. One is drug discovery for therapeutics, and the other is material science. Today, I'll mostly just be describing uses in the drug discovery platform. So in structure-based design, the design cycle often starts with a disease-associated protein target, and the goal is to find a hit. A hit is a compound that shows, or is predicted to show, measurable activity against some protein. These are usually identified by screening large libraries of molecules, either virtually or traditionally used to be done in the lab. These hits rarely have enough activity to make good drugs on their own, but they're a good foot in the door to a new therapeutic. It's a good starting point, but we still have a ways to go before we have a safe and effective new drug. From our hit, we use an experimentally determined crystal structure of our target protein to model how these different compounds interact with our target. With a hit, we generally have some problem properties that we need to figure out and fix. Maybe the compound doesn't bind strongly enough, maybe it's too big, maybe it doesn't dissolve well. These are all things that we need to have before we can actually sell a drug. This leads us to large-scale ideation and optimization. So we need to fix these things, and we can do this by looking at other compounds, maybe removing a carbon from our compound. Maybe we reduce how big it is, or maybe we add a new functional group to help bind it to the protein a little better. The tricky part about this is that compounds that improve our hit sometimes will lose other properties. So we end up playing a game of whack-a-mole. So it helps to be able to explore a lot of different chemical space in a short amount of time, so that we can actually find these Goldilocks compounds. Once we have these Goldilocks compounds, we can synthesize them and see if our compound is really as safe and effective as we hoped. And then based on our assays, we can adjust our models and then repeat the whole cycle again until eventually we have an ideal candidate to take to the next step. So the Schrodinger platform powers virtually every stage of this design cycle, except for the actual synthesis of the drugs. We haven't gone into robotics yet. We have applications for exploring chemical space, for predicting molecular properties, and for virtually screening large libraries of compounds. So now we're going to get into the mental space of a user. Our users are usually chemists, and they'll usually sit down at their laptop, they'll have installed our Schrodinger software, and they'll be working on some stage of the design cycle. So maybe they want to figure out how to fix the solubility of their compound, or maybe they'll want to screen a large library of compounds to find a new hit. So what does this look like? Let's say our user is interested in predicting how well their compounds dock into a protein. They may decide to use our application Glide, and they would run that using just a command line executable, Schrodinger run glide input.mae. So glide is the executable. Input.mae is our file format for these compounds or 3D structures. They'll launch a job, and that'll get kicked off to a scheduler on usually our customers' own on-premises clusters, which will usually have some kind of task scheduler like Slurm. From there, these scientific workflows kind of take too long to run on local consumer laptops, so it's required that they have their own computing resources. Yeah. So we abstract over these different schedulers with a component we call Schrodinger job server. So our job server handles interfacing with any of these schedulers. Our customers usually just have to install the job server, and then now their users or their users can submit jobs to it. So what is a job? A job is an executable and a set of input files. That's all that goes into the job server. Once there's a free node available, job server will start that executable with those input files and then collect all of those output files and log files and then push them back to the user, who once they open up their laptop can just download those files. Jobs usually run on a single slot or core in the queue, but many of our workflows require compute on the order of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of compute hours. So to be able to handle this, the jobs will create subjobs that batch up the work. These subjobs are just like any other job. They're defined based on executable and input files, and it's the driver job's duty to slice up these inputs, launch these subjobs, wait for them to complete, collate the results, and handle any failures that might have occurred. Doing all this subjob processing can be a bit tedious and require a lot of similar code. So rather than every application re-implementing this for every stage in their workflow, we implement a workflow engine. And a workflow engine is just an abstraction over this work that I just described. So it usually batches inputs, it handles subjob failures, it checkpoints if the cluster goes down. If a cluster goes down after 19,000 hours of compute, it's really expensive to just restart that, and customers aren't very happy about that. At Schrodinger, we've had a lot of these workflow engines that have cropped up over time. Oftentimes, an application team will write a new workflow application, realize that they're repeating code to distribute the input and start subjobs, and then write a new workflow engine if one doesn't already exist. So we've had a huge proliferation of very similar code and abstractions, which might lead you, and then these workflow engines have a patchy feature set. So everybody has their own features that are implemented for each of these workflow engines, and they're usually motivated by the applications that they were written for. This might lead you to the obvious question of why don't we just use the same workflow engine for all of our applications? And the reason for that is that all these workflow engines lack the most crucial feature, which is an expressive and usable API. So usually one team will go to another team and say, why don't you just use my workflow engine? And then they'll have a hard time using it because the APIs aren't flexible enough. And so then they just go and write their own engines. So where does that lead us? Cue Apache Beam. So we explored many different open source options for defining and running workflows, such as Spark and Flink. But all these solutions had very rigid execution models and engines that wouldn't fit into our customers' computing environments and easily interface with our licensing model, which is how we sell our software. The Apache Beam model gave us the flexibility to use a very nice and well thought out API, but that could still be run with our own execution model powered by Schrodinger Job Server. So we've named this new runner the Seam Runner. The Seam Runner has all of the same features as our old workflow engines, but all implemented in one place, while just outsourcing the usable API from Apache Beam. And of course, the really nice thing is if we later decide that the Seam Runner doesn't have the features that we need and we want to go to totally on cloud, then we could just use Dataflow or come up with another option or use Flink, et cetera. So we've built a lot of tooling around this now. This has allowed us to build unified and standardized tooling, which makes it easier to develop and troubleshoot and just frankly understand our diverse workflows. Before the Seam Runner, our different applications would all log events very differently, and that would require a lot of onboarding time, not just for our developers, but it'd be tough for our support team to understand every one of our workflows because each of them were very different and would log very differently. And oftentimes we didn't even have structured logging. So with the Seam Runner, we've automated log aggregation, which makes it easy to search and filter through logs, even when they're generated by thousands of workers and generated for hundreds of thousands of compute hours. This is another tool we've developed. This is what we call a workflow watcher. It's a web tool. With old workflow engines, the abstractions we had didn't provide enough structure to actually interrogate what happened during a workflow. So even basic questions like which stage of my workflow took the longest were very hard to answer. And even business questions like which part of the workflow requires an expensive license had a very different way of answering for every different workflow engine. Another feature that we've implemented is resource management. So you can now add per transform licenses to your Beam transforms. And this allows us to use the seam runner to allocate these licenses ahead of time before starting a job. Before this, it was, again, also very difficult to even look through your workflow and see where the licenses are or where they're required. And then we also use this same API to be able to consume resource requirements like memory and GPU and be able to intelligently decide where on a customer's cluster to actually run these things and make sure that the requirements are there. And finally, we've also created a seam transform catalog inspired by the Beam transform catalog. So you might see these slides and come away thinking that the value of Beam for Schrodinger has been in all the tooling that we've been able to create using Beam. But the real power for us has been actually the Beam model or abstractions. Before we found Apache Beam, we all used different workflow engines because we couldn't ultimately agree on a common language or set of abstractions to define our workflows. So because of this, we ended up using very general abstractions, executables and files, which led us to writing workflow engines that would just compose together these executables and wire together brittle input and output file names. And just generally, it would be harder to share our software. If any team developed something new, they would basically just tell you, OK, use this new executable, and you'd have to dig through the argument parser and try to find out how to actually use it. There's no real input validation or output validation. And then there's a lot of I/O associated with that. So we were seeing a lot of drawbacks from that system. With Apache Beam, we can start sharing all these components. This transform catalog is like our new way of sharing our components, so it makes it a lot easier. You can just go to this catalog, you can look at the different things that we can do, and then you can string them together very easily. We're also working on so this seam transform catalog is based on the Python SDK, but we're also working on a YAML version, which will allow us to work with a variety of technical ability. We have very strong technical users, but we also have users that are like medicinal chemists and don't feel very comfortable with command line. And to be able to give them a very easy and declarative API to start using some of our components is going to be really great. And then a couple of the actual applications that we now sell and ship. The left is the application that I work on, AutoDesigner. So AutoDesigner was our first application. It's a workflow for exploring chemical space given a compound where you want to vary a particular R group. So maybe one R group could fit a little bit better in the pocket of a protein, and you want to see what other possibilities there are. AutoDesigner is made up of 3 iterative enumeration stages followed by a bunch of filters. So you basically replace one part of the R group, and then you see, can it still dock into my protein? Or is it too big now? Or is it still soluble? And so we do this enumeration filter, enumeration filter, enumeration filter with different types of enumeration strategies in order to get a very diverse output set. And then at the very end, we have a very strict set of filters to then give to the user high quality compounds that they can consider next. This is a really powerful application because it's really hard to actually just, so the traditional way of doing this is people would just hand draw different ideas, and it's hard to do this in a very thorough way. So AutoDesigner lets drug discovery groups just explore a lot of options that they might not have considered otherwise. And then another Beam-based application that we are releasing this year is crystal structure prediction. In the late stage of developing drugs, you'll start to think about drug formulation, like how do I manufacture in a pill form. This process is usually is based on determining the lowest energy form that your drug might pack into. This isn't a very simple process. Mistakes can result in drugs that have very different effects that you might think. You might think that you've really guessed the right crystal structure, but then when you've manufactured it, it turns into something else. This can have really bad effects. Sometimes it can make a drug lethal or reduce the therapeutic efficiency of it. And sometimes it can result in just recalling the drug altogether. So it's really expensive to get this wrong. So our crystal structure prediction workflow predicts these different types of crystal structures that are most likely to actually happen. And the way it does this is you give it a drug compound, and then we sample a bunch of different conformers and ways that it might exist, and then we pack it in different ways to see what kinds of crystals it might turn into, and then we filter these candidates down using a series of filters. One filter is like an ML prediction to see how much energy it would have. We also use DFT and MD simulations to also filter these down until eventually we get down to the most likely of crystal structures. So both of these workflows are pretty high scale in terms of compute, but in terms of actual data, this is where I think we're a little bit distinct in our use case. We work on pretty small potatoes. So for our designer, we're working on like 100 gigabyte scale jobs, and for crystal structure prediction, we work on like terabyte scale jobs. These 3D crystal structures can take up a lot of space. And then compute-wise, they're pretty expensive, though I'm not really sure if it's big potatoes relative to other workflows. So what were the challenges that we had? Writing a runner is pretty hard. The Beam model is rich. It was a pretty daunting task to get started. I actually thought about writing a Beam runner like 6 years ago, but I went into it alone, and I didn't really think to actually email anybody, and it was a little bit overwhelming, so then I just dropped it. And then a couple years ago, I actually mustered up the courage to ask the dev mailing list, who were really helpful. Here's a thread where, I think this is the initial thread where I actually asked about doing this. And there are like many, like dozens of messages long threads where I got a lot of help from the group, especially Robert Bradshaw, who actually wrote a trivial runner, which was like the boilerplate that we actually started with. Another thing is developer adoption has not been the easiest. Even though I mentioned that the Beam API is really easy to use, it still has had its hurdles. A lot of our developers come from scientific computing backgrounds, so they're used to coming from labs and writing scripts, and they're used to imperative programming. So getting them to understand the declarative API and deferred execution was a bit of a challenge. But it's been noted, or I've heard at least a couple of times now, that after they get through the initial hump, that it's actually been fun for them to write new workflows. So that's been exciting to hear. We're also working on new developer education sessions dedicated to just teaching the Beam model fundamentals. And then I think the YAML transforms should also help a lot with this. So future direction, the Steam runner that we wrote is just batch-based. In scientific computing, there's really not much latency concern. People are happy to wait a day. Some of our workflows take weeks. It's really not a big deal. So for ease of initial implementation, we just implemented batch-based, but we'll probably implement streaming support later. And then also, another thing that we'll be implementing more is the YAML-based workflows. So in this screenshot here, you can actually see one of these pipelines that uses one of our products and creates structures based on these smile strings. And then after that, we'll be working on scientific prototyping usability. So our developers are getting more and more comfortable with using Beam, but where they get code is usually from the scientists. So we have a bunch of scientists that work with our developers, and they'll come up with their own prototypes in their own bash scripts or Python, and then there's usually a translation phase where we take their prototype and then turn it into production quality stuff. But it'd be nice if they started with Beam. And then eventually we'll work to use worker server-based execution instead. Right now, we don't have our workers communicate between each other at all. We actually just decide up front what the workers will work on. And then acknowledgements for my team who've been working with me for the past couple of years, and then the crystal structure prediction team who is here today too. And then big thanks to the Apache Beam developers who have helped me along the way.